Hey, all right, man. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's see where to start. This is, I think, I mean, it's kind of an honor to be asked or approached about doing this. It's not that much different from just consulting for game design in and of itself, but it's also going to have, or could conceivably have some uh, curricular, principle-based things, but obviously this is not a developed pedagogy,
Right.
and so in many ways there's going to be a lot more dialogue than it's not like I've said, well, okay, if you flip open to my textbook and consult chapter 3.5, the next set of exercises. Although working up something like that ultimately is not that bad an idea. So
Mhm.
the there's several angles. I'm curious on your thoughts on which you're going to find the most useful for yourself to start with. One is coming from uh, perhaps the most professionalized version. I want to publish a game. What do I do?
Right.
And that's often the approach that people used to bring to the Forge, which was, where's the phone booth? How do I get in? So I can,
Right.
walk out of the phone booth a real publisher, designer, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And um, and that particular ideal aside, it is true that there's things that people actually need to know, especially because of all the things that people say,
Hmm.
which aren't true. And then there's another approach, which is kind of pure learn by doing, which is to take the design you have in mind and just attack it and try and extract certain points and principles of what we're talking about as we go.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's the approach of kind of, I guess, phenomenology. What is role playing, and if it is the way it is, then how could we design for it? Which is
Mhm.
sort of the basic research approach. This is what
Yeah.
it is. So what could we do?
Right.
So I'm not sure which of those appeals to you the most, or if
I kind of like the second better. I tend to like really like. I'm a visual artist. I don't know if you looked at any of the work I sent you, but I spent a lot of time in art school with art teachers just kind of telling me like, well, you just kind of you draw the thing. That's how you draw. You just kind of draw it, and it really
yeah.
frustrated
Thank you
me as
so
a
much. Right.
yeah. They would never give me the sort of more mechanical approach that I preferred.
Excellent.
Um, as far as publishing, obviously, it would be nice to it would be excellent to publish stuff, but I don't think that I'm particularly concerned with making that my primary objective right off the bat because I feel like I have a lot of respect for how much practice it takes to get good enough for anyone to want your stuff. So like if I happen to to churn out something with you right away that was really good, that would be excellent. But I'm not really
Okay.
interested
So
in
let's take your current design as a labor of love and see what on earth a somewhat systematic approach might bring to it.
yeah.
Excellent. The first thing that I like to talk about with people is to remember that we're effectively designing an instrument. So if we were designing an entertainment product, that would be one thing. I like to talk about how when you're dealing with people in digital gaming, they have a definition of story or fiction, which is still completely the old school author driven thing.
Mm,
When they say story, they mean the thing that the user will eventually uncover
right.
by going left and going right and killing people and stuff like that. They will
Right.
eventually uncover the thing. And it's a good game when the thing to uncover is interesting.
Yeah.
So to them, story is still something that they've authored and the consumer, the customer, is
Yeah.
consuming. And so I like to try and revamp them in that conversation or to challenge that idea in conversation by saying, This is completely different. This is like selling a musical instrument. You can't, you can't sell the music when you sell the instrument,
Right.
because you really do have to tell the person, you know what, I can't play the fucking thing for you.
Right.
And so that leads to a great deal of difficulty. To go to the marketing and promotion thing just for a second, not to get stuck in it, it's really easy to sell the music.
Right.
It's really, really hard to sell the instrument. I suppose, you can sell instruments as identity. People who buy guitars and never really learn to play them or something like that. But still, it's you'll notice that there are not commercials on television for trumpets, harmonicas, pianos. It's just not a marketable phenomenon to sell a means of production of fun, which, if you think about it, is kind of like depressing.
Right.
But that's kind of what we're looking at. I mean, if we're talking about a role-playing game as an instrument of creation, even one with a heavy setting. I mean, I'm not saying that it's all improv. I mean, even one with a lot of content, but its use is still a matter of creation of fiction that we don't author.
Right.
Then that's what we're dealing with. So, therefore, it makes a lot of sense to say, what play is your design birthed in?
Right.
So I think all of my designs, and I can think of some experimental exceptions, but not many, all of my designs are birthed in play experience. And so that becomes the question. If you have, a fun draft or a fun set of notes sitting around that you poke at every so often, or scribble on every so often, or try to play once in a while, what kind of role-playing experience gave rise to it? What are you working from? Do you have some thoughts on that?
As far as, could you rephrase the question?
Yeah. Right now, you kind of do have a little, proto game, right?
Sure, I have many proto games.
Which is excellent. That's fantastic. Let's grab one.
Okay.
And the question...
The one that's most that has seen the most playtest is probably one called Kinfolk. It's I read Prince Caspian and then thought, what if C.S. Lewis was not a Christian but like an eco-anarchist? And so it's about like these fairies trying to save their world from the empire of man, and I wanted it to have like a definite ending, you either turn aside the apocalypse or you don't. And
okay. So as far as fictional / thematic input is concerned, I get that. Now let's think about it in terms of play experience. And from here, you would have to look. You said, you've actually done some play testing, which is fantastic. So, what kind of gameplay, what titles did your thoughts and procedures for this come from?
Well, I wanted to. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question right, but I wanted there to sort of be a way to have. I experienced in some story games versus some more like mainstream games that I wanted this to be very oriented towards action adventure, and I wanted there to be a little bit of the fiddliness of like getting from the broad like, do you win the battle, to like, what do you do to win the battle? But I wanted it to be where it happened really fast. It wasn't like you roll to see if you hit and then you do or don't.
But you wanted causality in there somehow.
Right. At least like even so, what I did initially was it was kind of all just a die roll at the beginning, and you played dice in sequence to do actions, and it worked pretty well 1v1, but it just kind of fell apart as you added more players. It got too weird, and it left out people for whole conflicts. But anyway.
So, but let's go with that. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I wanted some of the feeling of watching a cool action scene, but without a lot of the procedures that slows everything down in a game like D&D or something like that.
Sure. And the play experiences that this is coming from, I presume, is comparing times like you're talking about when it's just kind of like, well, we roll and then we talk it through.
Right.
Or, for example, we talk a whole lot and then we roll.
Right.
And so those, you can, to be really boring about it for a second, if we call the randomized device a fortune device,
Mm-hmm.
then we're talking about fortune at the beginning versus fortune at the end.
Right.
And we're talking about something that people have always, worked hard at in game design, which is let's get some fortune in the middle. We talk our way into rolling and we talk our way out of rolling.
Right.
And if you put that in sort of a chain, you have a lot of adaptive behavior, a lot of responsive behavior to what and sudden constraints, the unexpected as you go. In games where you have something that's like that, but it actually doesn't really do very much, then that becomes the pro forma rolling to hit.
Right.
For God's sake, when are we just going to work our way through these damn goblins?
Right.
What is it, an hour and 15 minutes? Okay, 2 hours and 14 minutes to go. I've been here before. Yeah. And so that's when fortune in the middle isn't doing its job.
Right.
So, okay. So the first thing is to say, all right, this is our play experience. We know it can work. We know when it doesn't work. We know when other things work, but it's not really what we're looking for or feel like what we want.
Right.
And so some of it is a technical judgment, thinking about when it doesn't work, for example. Some of it is just aesthetic. There's nothing particularly wrong with putting the fortune in any one of those places. It's just a matter of which one you want it to be like.
Yeah.
There's other principles too that I could be drawing on here, but let's see if we can talk then about a little more about the actual games you've played, in which that intermediary fortune mechanic along the way, in the middle of a situation, has been enjoyable.
I've enjoyed a lot of. I don't know if it's fortune in the middle exactly. I remember that the phrase from the Forge, but I'm not sure I understand it as well as I should. But I feel like I've enjoyed the sort of powered by the apocalypse sort of thing. So would that be considered fortune in the middle?
Well, yes. I mean, in the sense that you're rolling through a series of events, and the next thing that you do has to bounce off of what happened.
Right.
And so I was thinking, maybe I'm bending my own terms by trying to apply it to a whole situation. Thinking about some kind of encounter or some kind of chase scene or some kind of, dramatic moment of they want this, but we want that going on.
Right.
And you find yourself saying, well, I'm in the middle of it. This particular role isn't going to resolve the whole thing.
Right.
But it's going to make something change in the middle of it that absolutely everybody's now going to have to take into account. I mean, maybe I fall and break my leg. That's going to make this chase scene a lot different.
Right.
Maybe I'm able to turn the tide in some fashion where half of them or all of them go running off down the wrong road. But the idea is that the playing through the scene requires constant consultation with different announcements, different random effects, and different interpretations as you go through. So playing it, as you said, has more of a dramatic feel.
Right.
There are several things to keep in mind technically when we get to that, but for right now, let's just treat that as an experiential phenomenon that exists. And that we can make it happen.
Yeah.
So it's not as though it's a mystery. Although now eventually it's going to be a big question, or we can look at what you've done already. It's going to be a big question about whether yours adds value.
Right.
And that's why I was talking about versions of it that don't work.
Right.
Because that happens. All right, good enough. Let's think then. We can talk a little bit now about the inspiration to play. The inspiration to play is really what anything and everything resides on. If we don't have inspiration to play in other people, then there's no point. Then it's a book that sits on the shelf. Then at best it's one person trying to convince the others painfully as they try to learn it, reluctantly. And so that's no good. I mean, you're not going to play unless there's inspiration to play. So therefore, all role-playing games, even the ones that purportedly start with a blank page, all of them have something that is inspirational for use. Usually it's imagined fictional something or other. When I see when I see an illustration of the sort of one of these eco-Narnian fairies, and however the artist managed to do it, instead of relying on existing tropes, has actually managed to catch my attention and say, that actually looks like a pretty badass situation, or a pretty inspiring situation, or not just another elf.
Right.
Something looks interesting here. Something looks, something about the Prince Caspian-ness of it, something about the theme of it that you mentioned, whatever it is, it's coming through, and I'm interested.
Right.
I sit down at the table with you, I say, hey, if you're going to do some of that, count me in.
Right.
Now, it is completely reasonable that every role player who does that also has a certain amount of reservation and suspicion.
Yeah.
We've been fooled before.
Right. Yeah.
By such things. And so it's not just inspiration to play initially, which has to be there, but the process itself then has to provide its own new inspiration to play again.
Right.
Whether it's to keep playing for another 10 minutes, which is its own form of again, whether it's to play another session, or if it's a one-session game, to play the game again with someone else maybe sometime. But some kind of again. So that's really the huge aesthetic cycle of all of this. If this isn't fucking fun, I'm not doing it anymore.
Sure.
So rather than have this word generic fun be involved, which is great, I mean, it's true, but it's vague.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna get really specific about it. If the way we make things happen doesn't result in how things change, then we know we've been wasting our time.
Do you mean changing in the fiction, or do you mean changing?
I do.
Okay.
And that'll be clearer if I throw the counterexample in. We play for 2.5 hours. The fiction changes. And then you and I, sitting there, know damn well that it only changed the way the GM wanted when the GM wanted.
Right.
And so we know that what we did was basically, playing accompaniment or being improvisational thespians or otherwise, dressing up or ritualizing those decisions. But what we did, the choices of what abilities to use, the dice we rolled, the outcomes, didn't really have an instrumental effect on what changes.
Yeah, that's our authorial railroad thing.
Yeah. And so and there's scary ways to do it too, which some people I don't think people recognize as railroading. A way to play in which you do stuff and it is narrated, but it only really affects that pinprick of a moment, and the way it turns into another scene is pretty much at the improvisational behest of another person anyway.
Yeah.
So, and that's a subtler form, but it's quite pervasive and very dangerous. So anyway, though, here we are. We're looking at a game design, and we're saying how many decisions are involved in making things go, in those instrumental activities. How many decisions? Did I get to pick a character? Did I get to do this? Did I get to do that? A lot of the time it helps if the decisions are graded. So there are some things you don't have decisions about, and other things you do have decisions about. Some things you choose, some things you make up whole cloth, whatever it is, but you are you're shaping your participation in the fiction through a set of decisions. And then as we begin to play, you experience/shape your participation by the use of the instrumentation of the game in some way. The procedures, now you do this, now you roll that, now you choose this. So the next question then is, do the procedures that you have designed into the game, are they really giving people that participatory agency?
Yeah.
And second, are they doing so in a way that confirms their initial inspiration?
That's interesting.
Because otherwise I'm going to be pissed. I sat down willing to be inspired, suspicious as I was, and then I find out that I'm playing Shadowrun.
Right.
And good a hack of Shadowrun as this may be, it's not what I sat down to do in my inspiration.
Right.
I just described my experience with Vampire in the early days, in the early 90s.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and so you're sitting there going, what happened to my goth drama?
Right.
Here we're running around, running ops all of a sudden.
Right.
So
I can see that.
Yeah, and so that's one of the aspects of the instrumentation. And raw color won't do it. Just making the dice black and purple isn't good enough.
Right.
Right? So there's something about the nature of the instrumentation that is supportive of the inspiration. Especially when we start looking at the consequences of things that really change. When I'm working with someone on game design, I say, after we've played for a while and we can properly say that fictionally something's happened, what has changed? And that's really different from game to game. I mean, super different from game to game. What actually changes about the fiction itself? To speak of Apocalypse World specifically, I find myself very frustrated engaging with the text and then when I play. And I have never GM'd Apocalypse World. I've only been a player. And it seems to me that the GMs that I've experienced don't really seem to be doing what I engaged with from the text, not just in terms of the apocalypse, like I was talking about with Vampire, but more in terms of eventual outcomes of things. When we fail or succeed at stuff happening, how does that affect the world we live in? How does when we face fronts coming in at us, and this happens or that happens with this or that front, how are things different now?
Yeah.
And it particularly applies in Apocalypse World when it comes to the maelstrom, opening your minds to the maelstrom.
Right.
If the GM in particular is kind of just pretty much running with, I'm going to run Weird Road Warrior.
Right.
I'll just run Weird Road Warrior. I'll do fine.
Yeah.
Then when the players address those kinds of things or have expectations about those things, how does our life change? What do we know about the Maelstrom now? Stuff like that. That GM is kind of like, well, shit, I'll just throw another bunch of mutants at them.
Right.
Or I'll just be weird about something and whatever. And so I'm often quite interested in knowing how, in a game, after a certain unit of time, what category of changes are we talking about? Historically, we've got the increase in the power of characters. They're leveling up.
Sure.
We've also historically had the claim that what the players do actually affects the local circumstances, the fate of the realm, if you will, and in some fashion or another. Others end up being more episodic, and the answer is, well, nothing really, but you made it through and it was fun, and we'll do it again next week.
Yeah.
And so the question is, in the kind of fiction you're talking about, now you talked about how at the end of a fairly substantive arc, and I don't know if we can use Prince Caspian as an aesthetic benchmark without being locked into it solid. Right. By saying at the end of the novella, we can basically see whether whether progress has come to the realm or not.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, I have a very basic idea in mind. Just to go over quickly. What I was kind of thinking I wanted to do was that I wanted to have if you choose to play a full campaign of Kinfolk, you play 5 games, and it's kind of weird because I want to make it dramatically fun and interesting. But basically, what I wanted to do was each session you have a certain number of conflicts, and at the beginning of the game or the beginning of the session you pick a question, and the question has to do with the ultimate fate of the Kinfolk and the forest, and that magic survives, and all these things that you're interested in deciding through play. And I wanted it to be such that you win and lose conflicts as the players, and those have consequences. But ultimately, you if you win half or more of the conflicts, you get to answer the question at the end of the game.
Right, and so I see, but on the other hand, the conflicts individually do have their guiding individual impacts throughout play, no matter what. So therefore, that's a great anticipating what I was thinking of asking, which is the question at the end is actually less important than the things that are settled or established as we go. So the kinds of conflicts you're talking about are actually more interesting to me as a player, because after a unit of play, I'll be saying, well, what did we actually do? And yes, I know far off in the distance we will decide the fate of the realm. That's great. But I want to know what we did. And I want to feel as though we did it, and I want to know how things have changed now so that I can address that. I can be re-inspired.
Yeah.
To go back to the more familiar model, this is why it's always really inspiring when a game text shows me a picture of a beginning character and then positing an advancement system that's very intensive. Mm-hmm. Then they show you a picture of a few levels or a few skill increases later. And of course the character is older looking and is badassier looking and has an animal companion now and all that stuff. And so you're looking at that and going, aha, I'll start with being inspired by this, and as play goes on, I will be re-inspired to keep playing because I'll have that. It will have changed. And my guy will be different because of what actually happens, and that's cool. I can't wait to see what. how that goes. And I'll play again after that because that'll be cool. And so now, interestingly enough, people talk about this wrongly in terms of power. They say, well, I'm weak and later I'll be powerful and then after that I'll be more powerful, so that's why I'll keep come back. That's actually not true. You're just up against stronger opponents, so who gives a fuck?
Right.
So it's the inspiration of the aesthetics which is actually more powerful than that.
Interesting.
And so the point is, therefore, in a game like yours, when we go through these conflict situations and we have, as you've described, every session, we pretty much know that aspects of the fate of the realm will be coming out of what we did.
Right.
Therefore, the question is, when we are done with such a session, we look at our character sheets, or we look at whatever you have, whatever the game provides as a visual understanding of what we have to work with. I'm not even making a suggestion. I'm spitballing for purposes of conversation only. Say there were some kind of large square sheet that actually is the realm in some schematic or symbolic fashion or some kind of map, who knows, and it's there. And at the end of this session, there are certain marks or changes made onto that which aren't going to change. It may not be the fate of the realm, but that's consequential. That's happened. We did it, or failed to do it, and this is what's up. Who knows? The initial colony's factory has been established and is now up and running. They are making, I don't know, they've domesticated, or they've captured the spider colony, and they're making their spider silk, which they are now shipping off realm. They've got their production going, and the water's polluted by the damn plant, and there you go. That was session 3. The bastards got their colony going, got their factory going.
Right.
It's a dark hour for the realm. We got to do something about this. So if this goes on, the whole joint's going to look like this. So therefore, but that's good. We have a different map now, or a different realm sheet. Or if I'm looking at my character sheet, depending on the design of the game, looking at my character sheet, I'm saying, this is what my guy looks like now.
Right.
And I want to play this guy more than I was initially inspired to play my first guy. Because back then I was suspicious and reluctant. I'm not suspicious and reluctant anymore.
Right.
I know that what we do here makes things happen. And see? I got it.
Right.
Get out of the way. When's the next session?
Right.
And without that, I'm going to claim you don't have successful game design at all. Again, massaging that point by saying it's not the next session for a single session game. It's just being so happy you did it that you could conceive doing it again.
Right.
That's same thing. So without that, one falls into several dangerous traps. One is the fun later trap. It wasn't fun now, but it will be fun later, just you wait. Which is bogus. Another trap, which is, we didn't argue. We didn't suck. Nobody was visibly, disappointed by play.
Right.
And we're all friends, I guess. So since this wasn't a dreadful meltdown, we're going to call it successful play and meet again next week.
Right. I've been in some games like that.
And so I even have a name for that, which you may recall, zilch play. You're actually not getting anything out of it, but hey, it's better in your memories of 13-year-old D&D, so good enough.
Right.
And these few people can be relied upon to keep showing up, so hey, we've got a group.
Right.
So those are some of the dangerous traps to fall into. That, at least as far as I'm concerned, successful design says those aren't good enough.
Yeah.
So do you see how kind of this goes together? Now we can look at the instrumentation, the rolls to hit, if you will, and see whether they actually do generate the kinds of results that give you that re-inspiring effect.
Right.
And so, since there's no one way to do it, and since there's all kinds of different ways to be inspired and all kinds of different ways to do it, the sky's the limit, except we know that there are ways that don't work.
Yeah. And
we know that the hobby is such that we are still experimenting into the ways that do. And so that's when certain decisions, binary decisions, have to be made. You've already made some. The game runs for 5 sessions. That's a binary decision right there. How looking at the ways that games are finite or infinite. Look at other decisions you've made that are also binary. The fixed notion of this setting, which is fine. I remember playing the game Legends of the Five Rings. And we were playing, and one thing we found very frustrating was how the wizard characters, the Shugenza, really didn't fit in terms of the glory and the Bushido stuff going on. The magic system was very elaborate and created its own dynamic of play for those characters, and it kept undercutting the fun of dealing with glory, dealing with honor, dealing with reputation, dealing with crises of all kinds, of that kind. And at one point or another, we looked at each other and said, wouldn't this be better if we didn't have fighter wizard? Wouldn't this be better if we were all just Bushi? And, we'd have to deal with Shugenza, and we could have characters who were Shugenza. We could get married to a Shugenza. We could fight Shugenza, sure. But wouldn't it be better if our reward system, if you will, the mechanics of how things change and what we do so they change, kind of were in the same language for everybody?
Right.
What if we were all just, and especially given that this was this heavy setting, we were saying, maybe this really should just be a samurai game.
Yeah.
And along the lines is when I came up with Troll Babe. There are lots of influences on what led into Troll Babe, but one of them was saying, you know what, I want to make a game where you're just, it's not even like Sorcerer, where you are a sorcerer, case closed. Here, I was saying, we're going to lock down everything. You get to mess with your character's aesthetic details, which turns out actually to be a big deal. But functionally speaking, there's no choice. You're going to do that.
Right.
And so that was a binary choice compared to, the other options, which all said, whether there are 3 classes or 30, it's all that other option which says fundamental character role is a menu. Period. Here, no, there's no menu.
Right.
So that's a binary choice like I'm talking about. You've made a few of these choices already for this. So now we say, all right, given those sets of choices that you have pretty much settled on, at least provisionally, is what we're going to work with, now we turn to the basic idea of what changes. In this case, let's just say session to session. You talked about specific conflicts that have occurred, and their outcomes clearly are going to be changes.
Right.
What about for the characters? Do they change? They don't have to. Remember, binary choice. Characters change, characters don't change. Whatever. What do you think?
Yeah, I want them to change. I haven't thought about this maybe as much as I should have. One thing that I do want is that every character has a number of things called curses, and they're basically like role-playing directives where your curse is bloodlust, and so your directives are don't kill out of anger, don't do these things, and whenever you do them, you run the risk of becoming a darkling, basically becoming you're not a noble satyr anymore, you're a troll, that sort of thing.
Right. So it's kind of interesting. So yes, the characters are all themselves kind of labile. They're on the cusp of what they could become given certain choices. And so I'm kind of liking that. Particularly, I'm thinking of the whole Narnia thing where you've got pretty much gruesome versions of all the cool versions everywhere.
Yeah, and another thing that I wanted to have would be that because the game, and that's why it was so important to me to be able to like have a decently. I want there to be a way to resolve whether or not you lose or win a conflict that feels like the players have a choice and it's not just one die roll and then talk about what happened. Because I want ultimately for players to have the option to call upon their curses, basically to say, I'm going to give into the darkness a little bit in order to try to win this, because I want to answer this question. I want us to be able to answer the question, so maybe I'll sacrifice myself.
Which is great. So now we're talking. Now we're talking about how ultimately, all procedural dynamics, and most particularly those involving conflict, violent conflict or consequential conflict, and most obviously in most games, damage and death, all of those should be subroutines of that chain of the changes that I was talking about. So in other words, the fundamental of a game isn't how do I roll a hit. The fundamental of the game is how do I change. But it's true that the way you roll a hit is going to be a very important gear in that mechanism. So that's why I was asking questions at those sort of session level, change level things, and we've got our answers. We have basically the most important things I've heard so far is that the fixed conflicts or the conflicts that we experience through the course of the session are going to be both immediately and long-term consequential for the realm. Number one. Number two, every one of us is going to have a different relationship to our curse after having played this session. Even if I haven't changed my curse at all, that's still interesting because it still reflects the choices that I've made. So with those, we have changes we can swear by. We can say, all right, what is this game about? This game is about these two kinds of changes. There may be others. I don't know if they will be as important, but there may be others. And there also may be modifications. But for the curse decision to matter, that means we have to have a moment in the middle of a conflict where you make decisions about it. Rather than, as you say, well, guess what? We're going to fight these guys. You know what, guys? I'm going to invoke my curse. Okay, I'm not going to invoke my curse. Okay, ready? Everybody got their dice? Okay, we roll. We look at our result, and it says, medium outcome. And we say, all right, now let's talk our way. Oh, I guess I cut his head off, And it's frankly, I don't find that very compelling, just letting you know. Instead, in the middle of, wow, you just got taken out. We've got to get you help quick. And these guys are overwhelming me. And, I'm thinking about the conflict as a whole. Shit, we don't want them to set up that stupid spider silk factory. We really don't. All right, guys, you want to see what, you guys want to see what a magical forest creature's really got inside them if you piss them off enough. Have a taste. So, and another person might say, I don't, do the whole kind of, oh my God, Wolverine's claws thing. I dare not release the animal within. Oh no, and this is great. I'm making fun of it a little, but we all know that it's very compelling when you're actually doing the fiction and thinking about it. It's only
because this game, in part, it's funny that you mentioned that because this game in part responds to having played a ton of White Wolf and never getting the whole the world is at stake and you're a monster, and how do you get to what you want without losing yourself? That never happened in Werewolf the Apocalypse. Or
That's exactly what I'm talking about. We look back at the play that's informing this, and we can find play that was successful and play that was unsuccessful. And often the success is not about whether the mechanics just plain worked. Yeah, we ran a combat. Yeah, I got wounded. Yeah, we lived, Not about that, but more about whether it satisfied the inspirational urge that brought us to it.
Right.
And changed things enough, and we felt enough agency in those changes that we say, I'm looking at my character sheet now, and I am proud of I'm proud of what we did.
Right.
You can see what happened right here on my sheet. In that model of play where the character sheet is the primary instrument, I like to say, play is the means by which a character sheet makes another character sheet.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so if we then so let's hold off on this for a minute and just think about this as the big cycle of fun, and then we also have the sense of it's fun in the moment. The choices that we make are fun in terms of the way that pulling certain levers and picking certain things is fun, but since the scope of what to do with that is so broad, we have to keep those kinds of changes we were talking about in mind as our gold standards.
Right.
So if all of a sudden we get a little too hung up on exactly how an automatic crossbow targets one foe versus multiple foes. I mean, it's an automatic crossbow, right? I mean, do I spray the line of them, or do I focus on one guy? If I focus on one guy, I'm going to take more recoil, and I got to make my balance roll.
Right.
I mean, all those things can actually be a little bit. Well, how am I going to put it? All of those things can be super awesome in the service of the right aesthetic that we're talking about.
Right.
If they're not, then no matter how clever or how realistic or how balanced or whatever they may be, they're a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
So is that kind of helping you a little bit with sort of the principles of game design that we would bring to to a project, especially because the answers are so different for different things? It's not a checklist. I can't put up a checklist and, okay, do it this way, do it this way, do it this way. It's much more a matter of saying this project is becoming more and more and more and more itself as I go along.
That makes sense.
One of the things that I have seen multiple times is that people have talked themselves out of their own inspiration for making the game if they go too far, because all of a sudden they're making vehicle rules because their friend insisted that you have to have vehicle rules.
Right.
Or they find themselves, slightly brutal example, and this has not made me any friends. When someone says, I've got this fantasy setting, and I've said, fantastic, tell me, what do we got? I'm interested. I'll play in your fantasy setting.
Right.
What is it? Do I get to? With apologies, do I get to be a topless snake woman? Or whatever. The point is that I'm interested now in what's going to happen in this situation. And they say, well, first, okay, there's 5 dimensions and 13 worlds. And then I ask the question that loses me friends. Can we play in the good one? If you see my point?
Yeah.
The idea is the person was thinking of playing some kind of fantasy adventure at some point, but has been distracted by cosmology and diversity.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in some cases the 5 and 13 actually is the dynamic interplay among them, is the coolness, is the thing that
Right.
we will be affecting or will be affected by or something.
Right.
But too many times I've seen that it's just become a distraction because it's easy to start describing 5 by 13
Right.
as opposed to buckling down and concentrating on what was supposed to get us excited about playing.
Yeah, I have some friends who want to be, or a friend in particular who wants two, who want to be fantasy writers, and I noticed a similar dynamic with them with world building, where like they never actually get around to making their stories because they just want to build the world forever.
Absolutely. Yes, that is true. And so with now the same thing can happen in terms of mechanics, like I was talking about with the automatic crossbow.
Yeah.
The same thing can happen in terms of, the same thing can happen in terms of messaging. And I'm a huge fan of messaging in games. I am not, you want all the people who say, I don't want any messaging in my role playing. No, nope, sorry. I do. And so, but you can see that that can be a distraction as well. It can become its own. You get really scoped on it and really want to just keep hammering the message, and
Yeah.
you're forgetting that we're talking about play that other people are going to be doing.
Right.
So,
It's like its own way of railroading, where the author's just screaming their opinions at the players.
yeah, and that. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is there's so many different ways for that kind of distraction to take shape, and that hands down has been the single, the single crisis of design. And the fact is that people also get really, really interested in trying to write the presentation. They're thinking about how somebody's going to encounter it de novo before they've actually confirmed how fun it is for people who do get it.
Mm.
So in this early stage, super interested in your playtesting experiences, because that's where we say, to what extent are people enjoying the dynamics that you are prioritizing as the designer?
Mm.
And I'm thinking of a couple of people I know who are quite ruthless with themselves about this as designers. Paul Sega, who I just spent a week with in Italy, if people are having a great time with some feature of his design, but it is running counter to his inspiration for why he's making this game, he considers that a design misstep.
Wow.
He says, no, that belongs in some other game. I'm glad it was cool, but it totally borked everything that I want to focus on as the thematic, dynamic, and changing and satisfying aspects of play.
Right.
I'm going to snip that out with scissors and stick it on my shelf and worry about some other game.
Right.
Which is hard to do if you are in a mode where you are trying to please people. You want your friends to have fun after all.
Yeah.
And also, if you are a little bit anxious about maybe your self-image as a game designer or something, and you're prone to listening to whatever big name gamer is telling you in your playtest session. Oh yeah, that's great. Keep that in there. Fucking awesome.
Yeah.
And it's pretty hard to say to yourself later, no, I'm not going to keep that in there. That doesn't go.
Right.
So therefore, I really tried to punch home in this particular conversation the importance of, even if you can't articulate it to yourself. A lot of these things are nonverbal. The importance of knowing whether thing X is working how you want it to work.
Yeah.
We can talk later maybe about the role of surprise, where things work and you didn't realize they worked that way, and you're kind of like, oh, awesome. But that's a lot rarer than being diverted.
Right.
So So I guess the first step in the training of a game designer is to say, let's not lose track of the fact that design is a subset of play,
Mm.
and that there's not this kinds of transitive approach from design way over there to consumption way over there.
Yeah.
That instead, this design process, it's much more musician based.
Mm.
You compose because you're a musician. It's a subset. Well, you've probably heard my joke that role playing is the activity, design is the personality disorder,
Right.
and then the severe form, the part where you need interventions, is when it's publishing. But the idea is that let's not forget, when we design, that we are players utilizing our experiences as a way to make a new instrument. And I mean, really, there is no finite list of potential musical instruments in the fullness of time and human culture. There's no limit in terms of an actual list of instruments. You can't say, well, we're done. We've made the instrumentation there is, and from now on, it's just a matter of making them shinier or less heavy or something. We'll make miniature versions of the ones we know. We'll make maxi versions of the ones we know. No, musical instruments don't work like that. Somebody's going to come along and is going to make a cool new instrument. And so, therefore, instead of thinking of what kind of instrument in terms of the existing list, it's more a matter of saying, well, what are things that actually make musical instruments work at all, ever? And say, well, we have to, there are physical constraints and cultural and other constraints. There's also the constraints of who I am and what I know. All right, given all that, what kind of thing do I feel like making? That is a cool place to be in. But it's real easy to lose track. I don't understand it really, but it is really, really easy to forget. And pretty soon you have people saying you have to have so many pages of setting, you have to have so many character options, you have to have this, you have to have that. With all respect to your friend and mine, Vincent Baker, and probably through no fault of his own that I could identify, people are treating the Apocalypse World as that.
Yeah.
And that's no service to the game itself, actually, in my opinion. So, therefore, let's take a look, perhaps for our next get-together, if you're good.
Yeah.
It would be good to take a look at your drafts or your your summaries, and look at what's happened in play and say, all right, is this thing doing the kinds of changes to the setting, to the circumstances that I was hoping? Doesn't even matter if they're doing them very successfully. It's just, are those dynamics there at all? Are they actually occurring? What happened, briefly, in the last playtest of that particular game?
Yeah, so I more recently tweaked the curse system. So unfortunately, in that same particular game, the curses didn't come up very much. They were in the game, but the conflicts ultimately didn't drive them to use them. Like the outcome wasn't enough in doubt for them to ultimately use the curses. So the idea was basically you have a certain number of dice based upon how good you are at a given type of conflict, whether it's heroism or cunning or something like that, and then you would roll a certain amount of those dice and play one die at a time to I jump atop the ogre's back and slash him on the shoulders, and then whoever had dice at the end, whether it was the ST or the players, would win the conflict. But ultimately, it made it such that I had initiative based on whoever had the highest die showing, with ties going to the ST. and it made it so that players who weren't particularly good at a conflict often just sat them out until maybe the very end, because they didn't have as much opportunity to roll the high die and take initiative. And it also was kind of challenging because I was trying to be kind of compartmentalized and like, okay, this is a ken test where like you test your wisdom, or this is a cunning test, and or a social test, and people I couldn't manage to make as much sense to my players as combat does. Like they couldn't figure out how to make the repartee of an argument be
right.
Because in their minds there was like, well, I made the argument, do they believe me or not?
Right.
And when I would rebut them, they were like, well, I don't know what to say, I made my argument.
Right. That is that becomes quite interesting. We will talk later about the kinds of conflicts that you find the most important. And also look at some games which have played with these things to see where they get. Because one of the two things you're talking about, one of them is what you explicitly said. What do they do? If our characters are talking, what do they do, and how do I make that happen? Number two, what do I know? How do I know stuff? More importantly, what I called recently actionable knowledge. How do I know stuff that my character is empowered to act upon? And those two categories of role-playing and how they interact with fortune mechanics, dicey stuff, is not impenetrable, but we have very poor historical models to work with. And so, therefore, that work necessarily becomes more experimental. There's also the issue of adversity. It's very easy to understand that if I miss with my attack, damn, they've still got their chance to hit me. And if I had hit with it, and if I had hit hard enough, they wouldn't have their chance to attack me. That's great. I get it. This is why I'm attacking. This is why I'm, throwing up my dice into defense, because that guy's really tough. The consequences of failing this, succeeding at that as we go along are very transparent. In the conversational or clash of wills, or as Luke Crane calls it, the duel of wits, which actually the original game that I think did this was called Lace and Steel, in which you, for repartee, used exactly the same deck as you did for duels.
Gotcha.
And so, still though, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, or at a later date, I think, and especially using Dogs in the Vineyard as a touch point. To what extent is the back and forth routine of saying, okay, now I push this die forward? To what extent is it pro forma? If you can tell the outcome of the whole thing just by looking at the two rolls simultaneously, then that's a problem. And so it becomes a little tricky. I've often thought that I was very much interested in the dynamics of dogs dice conflict when you couldn't tell how it would go just by looking at the initial two rolls. Because then it mattered more about what you push forward with what, especially because what you were accomplishing with each iteration wasn't just coloring up the ultimate outcome. And that's where I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's kind of where you're feeling your way through the design. Which is fine. Playtesting's like that. It's like Braille. You go, oh, poke, okay, try this, try. Oh, that's hot. Ouch, burn my fingers. All right, going this way. So, it takes forgiving players. to kind of, I noticed you were jotting down a few things as we went, which is good, because what we're doing is we're building a set of principles to operate by that may actually, I think they are, I've been using them for consulting for a while, are actually pretty good design questions. And this is sort of the biggest scale of those questions. But it's already put us into the point of asking relevant questions about fine-grained resolution,
Right.
which is great. I know exactly what I'll use for the curriculum for the next session, for example. So topic 1, the cycle of re-inspiration, is pretty much the topic. And the fact that all the fine-grained resolution needs to be a subroutine of it.
Yeah. As an artist, I'm definitely very like it makes sense to me immediately, the idea that like everything should be in service to the ultimate aim.
Sure. Yeah.
The same painting or designing visually.
I completely agree. And there is room for productive spray sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I find that the nature of role-playing is such is that it's better to let the people playing do that.
Yeah.
They're good at it. And they're going to have the most fun with their own productive spray rather than enduring whatever it was you did in one of your playtests, at second hand. So yes, that I'm glad that makes sense to you aesthetically. The other thing I wanted to say is, as a college prof, particularly teaching biology, one thing I found was that if I paid attention to what didn't work in teaching that I had experienced or I had seen, in writing in particular, there's no point in being told be more clear.
Right.
As a note on this paragraph, more clarity. What the hell, and in biology, it was very much a matter of students coming in and saying, I studied so hard. And what you don't do is appeal to their guilty work ethic and say, study harder.
Right.
It's not going to work. It's not going to help anybody. It only makes people feel bad, and it's unproductive. So, what's the point? So in game design, I've been thinking about this. The thing to not say that's equivalent to those is to anticipate what some other person might find fun. There's only one thing you have to go on as far as that's concerned.
Yeah. What I find fun.
Yeah, and the point being that there may well be any number of people out there who already know that that's fun, and when they see it, they'll go, ooh, that guy gets it. I want to do the way this looks great. I've been looking for this. Others didn't know about that particular fun and are very surprised that it exists as they experience it. And then you find yourself in the difficult situation of trying to talk to these people because you have no common language, but they're fascinated by what you've done. And so that's even better. But I don't think either of those happen unless you're really using your own standards, right there in place, sort of unapologetically.
Right. I get made fun of by some of my friends because they like to play morally gray characters and they think mature characters are morally gray. And I do sometimes too, but I often like to play, like, even if I'm not picking that particular class, I'll play a paladin. I'll play somebody who has a strong set of beliefs. Maybe they're not lawful good, but they stand by those beliefs. And they have always made fun of me, like, isn't it boring to know what you're going to do already? And I always say that me playing those sorts of characters is a cue to the GM to put me in situations that make this hard for me. But I'm going to do what I'm going to do.
Right.
Make me pay for it. Make this, so.
And also sometimes to answer the question, well, maybe not this time.
Exactly, maybe
Maybe.
not this time.
And so, and I personally find that much more trenchant. You see, what's interesting about purportedly morally gray characters,
Mm.
the cheap way out is to provide an antagonist which is so heinous
Mm-hmm.
that the alleged moral grayness is just turned into white knight by
Right.
comparison. And that has been done to death. It's been done to death in the comics. There's nothing morally gray about the Punisher.
No.
You know, he's killing child molesters and people who, you know, mutilate their henchmen and you know, heinous crime bosses and all these terrible people who do the most heinous imaginable stuff. So who cares if the Punisher's a little gray?
Right.
Right? And so everybody gets to say, oh, he's gray. I love my morally gray characters. I'm kind of like, no, you are playing more of a paladin than I am.
Right.
You just get to dodge around it by having everything be bloodier and he doesn't shave enough.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely a curse from comics fandom, which has really bought into that. So
Yeah.
anyway, you want to have 4 meetings, 4 or 5 maybe, and maybe some play gets thrown in if we find it logistically possible. And then after that, if you say, okay, I feel like I've had 101, I want to do 102, then we can kick it forward.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right.
Sounds good.
All right, man. See you later.
Thank you very much.